Hit it, buddy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of Sparks Entertainment and Art, where we have so much fun talking with so many interesting people about all kinds of things related to the band Sparks. And I'm really looking forward to my talk today because it's kind of a social media tie-in. Christian and I have just finished up our conversation about Sparks in Outer Space, and we are going to talk about that album today because someone who named Rebirth got in touch with me and said, you had all these interesting points, and then he added all these other interesting points. And I thought it was great. So we're doing a little social media tie-in here with Rebirth. And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. Good to chat.
We're going to talk about Sparks in Outer Space and really go into that album for a little bit. But before we do, I'm wondering if you could perhaps just say a couple words about how you got into Sparks and what part of their music most affects you.
Thank you. Well, I actually got into Sparks in 1994, and it was around about the time of Gratuitous Sax. In fact, it was just before that, but that was the first Sparks album that came out at the time I was a fan. And I've always liked what I call the synth duos, and we'll be talking about that. And in Outer Space is sort of in a role within that. So I've always liked the bands that had one guy on keyboards, sort of scowling, and a singer with, doing all the melody. And all roads, if you like that, all roads lead back to Sparks, really. So I think it was just growing up a bit older, doing some research, the early days of the internet, reading a lot of music magazines, and then finally getting to hear their music for myself. And not instantly, but pretty soon falling in love with it.
Well, you mentioned that you did the research, and I can just tell people your research is meticulous and your thinking is thoughtful and deep. And so we have been talking back and forth about getting together and doing some kind of shows. And where we decided to go is with an album that I don't see as particularly deep, although it's a fun album. It's a fun album. And as Christian and I talked about, one of the things we love about it is it was fun. We didn't think of it as an A album or A plus. We thought it was a really fun album, and that was it. But you came at it from a little bit of a different place. You heard some more to it, didn't you?
I think it's self-evidently an album about popularity, about cool places, about looking better, praying for a party. So you can take all that at face value. I think that that's the world it lives in, and that's the world it's portraying. Now, one thing I would say is it's a very American and particularly a very, I'd say, Californian album.
Yeah.
And so it's not very British in a way. It's really interesting for me to hear them go back to kind of LA, and it's almost like a kind of road trip around LA at night. You feel like you're in a car with them, and they're cruising around, showing you all these characters and all these places. So it's almost like a little movie for me, and it really takes me back to, well, it takes me to a place that I've never been for real. Like I've never been to LA or anywhere, so I've got all these places, things like Balboa Island and all these names that are mentioned in the album, and it's really interesting and it's very exotic to listen to for me like that.
Well, in their original planning for the song Cool Places, they had, this is what I read, who knows if it's true, but this is what I read, that they originally intended to call out a number of LA venues and locales.
Right.
And then they decided that's a little too cheesy, and they decided they didn't need to do it. But it really is an album placed in LA, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, yeah. But that's not to say that it's not wider, I mean, I think, a lot of the stuff is maybe quite teen based. So we've all been teenagers. We've all been there at home when thinking everyone's going out having a good time. And so that's sort of, praying for a party and stuff. And we've all had some of the love situations maybe in some of the lyrics. And I think everyone goes through that phase of wanting to be popular, wanting to be cool. That's international, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's the same in London or Brighton or somewhere in the UK, Manchester. The places might be different, but I think the characters, they're pretty universal.
Yeah. But one of the themes that I always come back to in my thinking and that really motivates me to do this show is this idea of the context in which they were making their music.
Yes.
That it's just the fascination that they've been doing this for over 50 years and the context in which they're operating, as well as the impact on the environment. And when you talk about it as being an LA album, you're kind of getting to that theme in a little way.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, because obviously when we last chatted, we were talking about Number One in Heaven, and I think one of the reasons that was such a kind of deep, long chat is that kind of album. I think it's a very studio-based album. The songs are about things like heaven and to the life and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then I think we didn't really talk about Terminal Jive, but I think the idea we both got from that was that it was frustrating for the males and they were away from their live audience and there were a load of session musicians and it was very corporate and it was very watered down and over slick in the sort of studio way. And so the follow on from that, I think, was that they thought, no, we want to be a rock and roll band. We want to play live again. And so then you had Warm and Angst, brilliant albums.
Absolutely brilliant albums. Yeah.
And but as you know, if you're sort of following that in a linear thing until you really get Sparks, there was one of their songs on a more recent album where they said, "Our inconsistency is our consistency." Is it
Yeah.
Pacific?
Pacific Standard Time.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite of their more recent songs, and I think that says it all. They've gone synth pop, then they sort of right, we're not working with guitarists anymore. Then Terminal Jive, and the guitars come back, and then it's sort of we're not really a synth band. But I think Cool Place, well, I think this album, it seems to like, it combines all these last few albums and it's like they finally merged it. It's really electronic, it's really synthy and it's got drum machines, but it's also got the band and it's songs that could be played live and indeed were played live. Have you heard any of the live versions of these songs?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. In my interview way back with David Kendrick in 2013, and then when I had him on the show about a few weeks ago, he reiterated that as they played, while the band's involvement on the albums got less and less, the live performances got better and better.
Yes, and I think that's really interesting and unique, and I can't think of many other examples where that's been the case, with the songs that are really great live and they sound $1 million, yet the recording itself doesn't really feature the band in the same way. It may be more common nowadays, but I can imagine back in when that happened, that was probably quite a new way of sort of doing stuff.
But that's always been their motif. They've always put on these amazing live shows that always rocked hard
Yeah,
from the very beginning. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and so I think that's always been a big heart. They obviously love playing to a live crowd, and my feeling is they probably really missed that.
Womp and Angst were kind of putting them into that new wave feel and bringing them back in America and, catching up to what was going on in America at the time.
Yes.
But this album took it a step further and really placed them in LA. And the other two hinted at it. But this one is one that put them squarely in the LA context, didn't it?
Yes. It feels self-confident. It feels like they're very self-confident, and I can understand it. They took the production reins, and maybe they'd worked with Mac, and they'd worked with Harold Faltermeyer and Giorgio Moroder, and they'd watched all these people, and it just feels like this. It feels more pure Ron and Russell. Do you feel that?
I feel like with Womp, they decided it was time to do a reset. So they went back to their roots, which is getting a band together, rocking out, having some fun with it. But I think at the same time, the synth influence that they were really intrigued by and which started to really permeate their music with Number One in Heaven and then the Noel album and then to an extent Terminal Jive was something they really liked to build on, not only because of the sounds and the freedom it created, but because it really allowed them to express themselves the way Ron and Russell purely wanted to express themselves in a studio. Thoughts?
Yes, and it's funny because I was listening. No, I totally agree with that, and yeah, it feels like that. But I also feel that if we look at Ron as a keyboard player, so much of Ron's thing is weird keyboard sounds, and I guess the thing about the synth is it just made it easier. It just made it easier.
Yeah.
But I think Ron he'd find something good on anything that had a keyboard. He'd probably find a way of doing something good. And I think by the time of In Outer Space, and I was listening to a lot. You were talking to Christian about the Lindrum, the drum machine. Uh, so I think that was probably the technical innovation on this album. Was it was the first Sparks album with drum machines, maybe. Uh, I don't
Yeah.
think there were
Well,
any
I
before.
don't know if it was the first, but it was the first where they were doing the programming and where they were really in
Yeah.
control of what
Yes.
sounds they wanted. And take a song like Sparks, All You Ever Think About Is Sex, which has that great drum beginning, which is fairly irrelevant to the rest of the song. But
That's right. Yes.
yeah, good.
Now, a question. I suppose you know if David Kendrick had anything to do with that drum. Did he do any of the
He
programming?
said no. I've
Or...
talked to
Okay,
him
yeah.
about that, and he said no. I don't know if that was in the interview, but he said no, not
But I
really.
do wonder if they maybe worked on the live versions with him doing the drumming, and then maybe they just tried to sort of replicate what he was doing, or if they actually came up with the songs.
On the
But
live version, they don't really replicate that.
okay, right, okay, yeah. So that's quite interesting that the songs had that versatility then
Yeah.
that they could be done in both ways and still sound good.
They had guitar, it seems, where they wanted to, very carefully placed, as opposed to writing guitar-focused songs like they did on the last two albums.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, it was really
yeah.
Ron. This is Ron getting back to his core arrangement instincts, where he doesn't want a band just playing out. He wants to have this piece here, this piece there, this piece here. He has very specific ideas of how it should sound.
I thought there was something you said that was really interesting when you were chatting to Christian, which is that Ron can write really complicated songs with different key changes and different time signatures and almost a million words, and yet here it seems like the whole point of the album, the whole reason behind the album is to keep it very simple, very
Yeah.
streamlined, as few words as possible, and yet that to me is what makes it funnier in some ways. It's or maybe the jokes stand out a bit more because it's less wordy, and so that it's maybe a more broader album in a sense, but I don't think it's any less clever or funny for that. I just think that's how he was choosing to write.
So I've heard it said that uh, something I wish I looked a little better. Somebody saw as autobiographical. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it gets back to that whole scene that he's trying to capture, which you talked about earlier.
Yes, absolutely, and as I was saying earlier, the teen thing, and it kind of follows on from Tips for Teens, maybe even a bit from My Other Voice. It's that same part of someone's kind of mentality where the all around them is shiny and popular and sexy and cool, and then you've got the kind of insecurities. Do I measure up to this? Am I, you know, it's not me. And that's what that song gives me. It's one of the more insecure songs on the album, definitely.
Oh, sure.
Uh,
Well, where do you place this album in context of what it means to you personally? And do you feel that this is an album that you really connect with, or do you feel like it's just a good album that has some interesting themes?
I feel I do. Like I say, I mean, maybe as you grow up, you grow out of those things. But I think I've been through those phases. I mean, I've certainly been, praying for a party, like I say, when you're younger and you just want it, you think there's something better going on somewhere else. And I think it's universal. I think most people, have been through, if not everything on all the songs. I think they're very everyday themes. They're things that a lot of people could relate to. I think.
They often have themes and ideas that they want to convey, but they also like to have fun. And
Yes.
they can be a really fun band. And I think sometimes, I mean, that's really the theme of my whole show, which is the entertainment and art. And sometimes they put one ahead of the other, but it's always there in some capacity.
Well, that's it. And that's the reason I like to talk about this album. It is really fun, and I know you were sort of I think praying for a party. I wanted to get one of the lyrics. It was "Please, baby, please."
Yeah.
I think that's hilarious. Some of the lyrics are there where he says sort of, speak the language when I am near.
To me, it just works as a whole. It works as a whole. And even if any one song That isn't one of the, there's one song that is one of my all-time favorite Spark songs on here. But leaving that aside, as a whole, it works. The album just
Yeah.
works.
To me, it's a very kind of speedy, fast. There's some slower moments, but it's a very adrenaline-packed album. It feels like you're driving along in a fast car. It feels like it's not hanging about. It's all very fast and it's very up tempo. And apart from Dance God Damn It, where suddenly just it kind of all that speed just dissipates and you get this very slow, ponderous song which is about dancing. And again, it's what is it? The lyric? It's uh, music so loud that you're in pain. It's just funny. It's
That is just a good song. It's so
yes.
funny.
And I think it's, is it autobiographical? I don't think it's about Ron, but I think Ron identifies with people who are like that. I think he gets it. Maybe if he wasn't in a band, he'd be struggling. I think a lot of people have said that about Sparks. Is what would they do if they were not in Sparks? What other jobs
Nobody
would they
knows. I don't think they know. I don't think they have a
do?
clue on that one.
But that's and that gives it this sort of almost desperation. Um, that it's you're craving popularity, you're craving being cool. You've always got to go to the cool places, but it's like it's almost too, a bit like with Number One in Heaven. It's pushing it too far to the point where if he stops for one moment, he goes, "I get scared when I'm on my own. Don't leave me on my own." And I think that's quite an interesting line because what's he scared of? What's he running away from? Why doesn't he just want to sit on his own for a bit and relax? Why
But
does he
that,
have to fill
as
it?
you brought out at the beginning of our conversation, that's kind of a theme that's from the very first. Cool places, he wants to go
Yeah.
out, he wants to do those things. What would happen if he didn't, or if he wasn't popular, or if he didn't go to a party, or if he was not just obsessed with having sex, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I said that's kind of between the lines, isn't it?
So, final thoughts on this album.
So, although I said it wasn't really a hit in Britain, what I think it did do was influence a lot of music that was successful in Britain. And I think that's why it's important, is because you hear a lot of late 80s stuff and you think Sparks were doing that in 1983. So, in that sense, I think it was maybe a bit ahead of the curve. And I mean, that stripped down drum machine, dance rock stuff, which was kind of, I'd say, early 83, still pretty ahead of the curve for that. So I think it influenced a lot of stuff following on from it that I did like. I also think it's part of the trajectory that runs all the way from Number One in Heaven, really to the present day, but certainly up to Gratuitous Sax of Sparks working out, are they a rock band, are they a dance band, are they an electronic band? So it's very up tempo. I also really love Jane Wiedlin. I think her performances are great, and you don't get that very often on a Sparks album. A sort of featured guest singer. So I think
No,
he's
I actually like Lucky Me, Lucky You a little bit more than Cool Places. It's just such a
okay.
sweet
Yeah,
little tune. Yeah.
let the
Well,
Go Go's.
you've
Really.
said some really interesting things there, that it is a little bit ahead of its time, and it sounds like we both feel that it was part of this early effort to set the template for where they are now. You can
Yeah,
really hear it.
absolutely.
You can see the line.
Yes, yes, definitely. There's always a good spirit with Sparks. It's never hateful. It's never looking down on anybody. I don't think he's mocking anyone. I think he sympathizes with them, and he's just writing about it and having some jokes and
He's writing
making some
about what
points.
he's seeing. He's in LA, and these are some of the things that he's seeing, and he decided to write about it. And maybe he likes people who are just out there praying for a party. Who knows?
I don't
Yeah,
think it needs to be, and I think that's why it's really good to talk about it because I think it shows such a different side to Sparks than some of the other stuff, and but nonetheless a really important side to them, and are very still popular. People still love these songs. They're not dated
absolutely.
in any.
Well, Ad, thank you so much for just finding some time to just talk about this album and sharing your thoughts. It's great. You've certainly given me a lot to think about. Others will love to hear your thoughts too. And I just love
Thank you.
just really glad that you came on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Great to chat and keep up the good work as always. Massive fan of everything you do. And yeah, the Noel thing is fantastic, and it answered a lot of questions. So it's great stuff.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for our discussion about Sparks in Outer Space. One of those great albums, often overlooked, and a lot of fun. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ad. We'll see you soon with a brand new episode. Bye-bye.